Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
Privilege and pleasure to have a chance to talk to David King. David, tell me when and where you were born.
I was born in Durban, South Africa, 1939.
When about 39? August?
12th of August.
August, I remember that now. A lot of people like to talk, or maybe they don't like, but they do talk about their ancestors a bit. Maybe back to their grandparents or even earlier if there was something significant they'd like to say. Sir John Gurdon went back to the Norman Conquest, I seem to remember, but some people don't go that far. But were there any of your ancestors you'd like to pick out, and particularly your grandparents, if they had any influence on you?
Yes, I don't know an awful lot about my ancestry, except that at one point I had to trace back to find a British grandfather or great-grandfather, somebody I could claim British heritage from, because there was a period after South Africa was kicked out of the Commonwealth when you were allowed to apply for British citizenship without going through all the formalities if you could show that you were of British parentage, and it had to be through a father's line and through legitimate marriages. So I did get back to my great-grandfather, who was himself born in Wimbledon, and he then travelled out to South Africa, and on my grandmother's side, the parentage was equally from Britain but further back, and I'm not too sure how far back. But it was from this part of Britain, so it was from Cambridgeshire.
And did any of your grandparents have any influence on you? Did you know any of them at all? Or?
I knew my grandfather. He died when I was about 8 years old, and I wouldn't say that he was a major influence. He was a very Victorian figure. His wife, I remember with enormous interest, used to taste every bit of food that was on his plate before he would eat any of it.
Was this for poison, or?
I think she was being checked on. That was the story that.
When you say his wife, is that your grandmother?
My grandmother.
Yeah.
And my grandmother was this wonderful grandmother figure who told us stories and was utterly charming. They had this lovely old house in Durban, Florida Road, 308 Florida Road, and it was very much a colonial house. It had a corrugated iron roof, and it had a balcony all the way around the house, a single-story house, but very generous spaces and plenty of balcony space where the well-shaded, and you could move around the house to keep out of the sun at any point. So, and very large trees, avocado pear trees in the garden. And so on. It was a great place to visit as when we were young. My father moved from Durban up to Pretoria when I was 3, where he got a job in a glass bottle factory. He was an accountant. And then when I was 5 or 6, he moved to Johannesburg, and then I was brought up in Johannesburg.
What was your grandfather? Was he with this large house? What was his occupation?
He was a shopkeeper, and it was clearly a shop for the well-to-do of Durban. And from what I can gather, it was both clothes and cloth.
Tell me something about your parents' characters. This is rather influential on us, what your parents are like, and it'd be nice to hear whether they were encouraging of your work and university background and so on, whatever.
My father was an extraordinarily powerful influence on my life in a very directed way. And so I'm not only saying that he checked as he did my school reports and his expectations were very high, and I have an older brother and the two of us went through this together, but he was also very keen to establish us as good citizens from an early point. And so we were each sent out to work in holidays, and actually I also was working on Saturdays from the age of about 13. So we would have a 2 or at most 3 week family holiday, but otherwise when all the other kids were on holiday we were working. And my father's job in Johannesburg was with a paint firm, and his idea was, he had become company secretary in my memory quite early on, and his idea was that his 2 sons would take over the company. I'm sure that was in the back of his mind. But his idea was that, that each of us, if we were going to become a manager in a company, would have experienced a first-hand every inch of the company. So I worked on the factory floor as a youngster. I carried bags of pigments on the factory floor, along with black workers as they were then. I arrived at work at 5:30 in the morning and got off at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. It was an extraordinary life. I can look back on it and say that. At the time I just thought every other kid was going through this. So I went into the accounts division, just literally filling in accounts by hand. These are the days when there was a paint shop in the middle of Johannesburg, a very beautiful building, and there my father was based on the first floor. Each transaction would come whistling up to his office with these
one of those little things that go
vacuum tube things.
Yes.
And so one of my jobs was sitting there pulling these things down, checking the numbers, of course all done by hand. And so I went through the paint factory, the accounts, the sales, and I also went into the laboratory. My father had no ambition for us to stop off in any one of these, but rather to experience them, so that by the time we were 19 or 20, he felt he could have us promoted through the company, and we would know the business from the ground up. It's a wonderful idea. Very much the sort of Victorian father, spoil the rod,
spare the child.
Yes, yeah. And so we did get punished if things didn't go well, and it was sometimes the rod on the backside.
Physical
Yes.
punishment.
Yeah. So, as I say, at the time I didn't think this was particularly strange, except that my brother and I didn't develop an awful lot of friendships, because this was quite all-enveloping. And my father's loyalty to the company was absolutely total, and that was infiltrated into us, or infiltrated is the wrong word. It was embedded into us from childhood. And so I had no question in my mind about what I would do, but my father, it turned out, was watching each of us. And my older brother, he called him in, 2 years older than me, and said, when he was 17, right, said, which bit of the company do you enjoy most? And he said, the accountancy. So he was sent off to do a Bachelor of Commerce. And I was asked, and I said, the laboratory. Now what had happened was that the laboratory was in Durban, and my parents were living in Johannesburg, and as a 15-16-year-old, I went down to the laboratory, and the head of the research laboratory was a Dane who was divorced, and he took me out on the town every night. I had the most wonderful time. So I was staying in a hotel and being entertained by this Dane and introduced to the adult world.
How old were you at this point?
15, 16.
Ah, mm.
A rather young man to be
Mm.
experiencing this. And my father, of course, was thrilled because I had been thoroughly bored by the accountancy. I quite enjoyed the factory floor. I didn't enjoy sales, but I came back from the laboratory saying, oh, that was marvellous. So he said, fine, we'll send you to university to do a paint chemistry degree. And I had a close friend. We used to play tennis together. Baxter Pierce is his name. And Baxter had this enormous influence on my life in the sense that what he said to me was, don't do paint chemistry. That's very limiting. Just tell your father you should do chemistry at university. And that's how I came to do chemistry at university. Now that story would seem to indicate that it was pretty random what I went into, and that's not quite true. Of course, I enjoyed the work in the paint laboratory as well.
Mm.
And so my background and schooling, I think it's fair to say that my inclinations were towards English and history more than towards the sciences. I rather enjoyed biology rather than the physical sciences, so it's a bit ironic that I've ended up as a physical scientist. But I think that I used to irritate the teachers, whether it was in religion or other subjects, by going for the jugular. I mean, all I was doing was trying to find out what they meant. But it turns out I was asking rather awkward questions. And so this questioning did lead to an advisor saying to me, you should go into law. And as a matter of fact, I think what I see was the development of a highly rational person. I was always breaking things down into their rational components. So that my interest was there. I do have a memory that is jogged by a little photograph of me playing with guinea pigs when I was 2.5, 3, and so this is an age before I had moved with my parents from Pretoria to Johannesburg, so 3, maybe 4. And I was reprimanded by a horrified mother who found me with a guinea pig that had been totally dismembered. So I had taken a sharp knife from the kitchen and taken this guinea pig apart. And
when you were 3?
3 or 4, it was something. Yeah. And I mean, my excuse to her was, and I'm saying excuse because I felt from her mood that I'd done something wrong, was that I was just trying to find out how it worked. My second excuse was that I believe it was dead before I started.
That's fascinating. Well, you mentioned your mother, Ben. What sort of person was she?
My mother was a rather insecure person. Imagine the situation in South Africa. We had servants, a gardener, a cook and a cleaner, and they lived outside the main house in small rooms at the back of the backyard. And I think my mother therefore spent most of her time telling the servants what to do rather than doing things. She couldn't cook. And she did play a lot of tennis, and that developed into bowls later on. And then she became chairperson of an old age home, and she put a lot of time and effort into that. But I think it's fair to say that my memories of her were of anger and control without any sense of direction, whereas my father clearly had a plan for us. And I do think that a big part of his plan was good citizenship. And the other part of the sort of parental story is, well, twofold. First of all, I got married before I left South Africa, and this is sort of jumping ahead in the story. So I was made to leave by the government, and it was all fairly hurried. And I had a girlfriend, and we decided to get married, mainly because her parents were very keen that we got married before leaving. Her parents knew, my parents didn't, that we couldn't come back. So, because neither of us was religious, we weren't going to get married in a church, and my mother simply said, in that case, we're not going to recognise it as a wedding, and we're not coming. So instead of getting married in Johannesburg, we got married in Cape Town to avoid the embarrassment of my parents not being there. And then my parents came down, this was my father pushing it, to say goodbye to us. So we went to the registry office, got married, and then got on the boat and had a wedding party without them acknowledging it. My father then, without my mother seeing, gave me a cheque as a wedding present and simply said, don't mention this to your mother. So there was this rather strange relationship between them. My father is a figure that I respected enormously, and my mother, on the other hand, was a very shrill person around and very difficult to deal with. As we move forward in the story, you will see that I was picked out because of my attitude towards apartheid. My mother was, if you like, the supreme example of the defender of apartheid. My father had a much more subtle view of life.
I was wondering how that was linked to your wedding, because you said after you got married you had to leave. As if did you marry a black lady? Or
No. I had to leave because of my political views.
I see.
Not for that reason.
Okay. Well, let's just go back to your school briefly. Do you remember your first school? I mean, sort of preparatory school.
Oh, absolutely, with utter clarity. The sort of disastrous beginnings of going to school. Yeah, we lived in a little suburb called Parkview, and I went to Parkview Primary School, the local state school, which was a 15-minute walk from home. And I suppose the instant I remember was just walking into school feeling utterly terrified, as I'm sure many.
You were a day boy.
A day boy.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Nothing. No particular reason to feel terrified. It was a perfectly good school, but my father felt that the school wasn't adequate for us, and wasn't developing our intellects, and so we were taken out of the school and put into St. John's Preparatory School, which was a private school in Johannesburg, and from there into St. John's College. The most spectacular school building you can possibly imagine out there in the middle of Africa. Stunning set of buildings on this ridge in the middle of Johannesburg, next to the wilds, a big park. So very privileged existence.
Was it a good school, St. John's?
St. John's was, and I think still is, probably one of the top 3-4 schools in South Africa.
And you were a day boy there?
Day boy there.
Do you remember any of the teachers at St. John's or the previous school as influencing you at all?
I mean, my memories of school, preparatory school, are of course close friendships, and these were long-term friendships. You know, we stayed friends until we matriculated. And teachers, it's a little sporadic. What happened when I was at school was that I had a series of illnesses, starting with polio, the 1948 epidemic in South Africa. Yes, 48. And that must have hit my immune system, because I then had scarlet fever, meningitis, encephalitis, and so by the time I was, it would have been about 1952 was the encephalitis. It was simply one after the other. I was into hospital and out, and then back again. I really had a very interrupted period of school. And then I was in the, from the move into the senior school, and the illnesses stopped. But at that point, it was decided that with all these illnesses, I should be taken out of sport. And I think that almost damaged my life at school after that, because if you weren't
No, I was going to ask about sport.
if you weren't playing sport, it was quite difficult. I came back in to play sport in my last 3 years at school, and thoroughly enjoyed that. Played first team hockey. My parents were keen that I wouldn't play rugby, although that was the only real sport in South Africa. But what happened as a result of not playing sport, Saturday afternoons was school all watching the rugby team. There was actually a roll call to see that everyone was there. So it was very disloyal not to be there. Now, because I wasn't playing sport, I had an interest in painting and putting oil on canvas. My parents agreed that I should apply not to go to the first team rugby match on a Saturday, which was a disaster from a social point of view. I therefore was a very disloyal person. But I was taught art by an English woman, and this was oil painting at a very demanding standard, and I thoroughly enjoyed that. I mean, I would look forward to getting back to the canvas each week. School teachers, I suppose in terms of the sciences, we had a school teacher in biology who had an influence on me, but not quite in the way he intended. So he was a good teacher, but very much expecting us to return what he'd given them by rote, what he'd given us by rote. And so what happened with my challenging business was that we got to the point where my challenge on biology also affected my attitude towards religion, where he was saying, and there are molecules that have something called a life force, and these are molecules that can repeat themselves. And this was early days leading up to DNA, so we still didn't know the structure of DNA, but and I was keen that he should explain to me, what made these molecules different that had a life force, and it was very clear from his response that he felt that I was going beyond what a school kid should be asking. So he challenged me to think about this, and as I say, in a way he hadn't quite expected. That was quite a big moment. We used to dissect animals, so I'm back to where I started when I was very young. I thoroughly enjoyed that. In the laboratory, interestingly, chemical experiments didn't terribly interest me, but I did have my own little laboratory out in an outhouse at home, but remembering that this is Johannesburg and gold and diamonds were around us in a very big way. We were always aware of that in Johannesburg. And I had been taught that diamonds were actually made of carbon. I decided I would make some diamonds in this little place. So I set about embedding chunks of carbon into lead and melting the lead and then quenching it very rapidly and then cutting up the lead expecting to find more diamonds. It turns out the pressure wasn't quite high enough, but the idea wasn't bad. I think that was the closest I got, therefore, to an experiment was to have an idea and then see if I could carry it through. But the business of making fireworks and so on didn't really appeal to me. That was not the fun of it. It was understanding and then using understanding to develop ideas further.
You mentioned painting was something you did on Saturday afternoons, and I noticed when you came into this room you looked particularly at the paintings. This has presumably been an interest that's continued for
Yes.
you. I mean, do you paint now, or?
So when I we're going to jump around a bit, but
Yeah.
when I was at university, I was still painting, but at this point, I started thinking about what my career should be. So finally, as I graduated, I just spent the next month thinking about this. My father very clearly was going to go into the company. I had a professor of physical chemistry who thought I was good and wanted me to do a PhD. So there I was, thinking about this. And I was, by this time, becoming politically interested. And I thought, well, either I'm going to go into art, I was also interested in photography, and that will be my career, or I can do science and then I can keep the art going. It turns out that's a mistake, in the sense that I got less and less satisfied with the art I was doing because I just didn't give it enough time and thought and effort. And with art you've got to feel that you're actually doing something worthwhile. So I switched my interest from painting directly to art more generally. So I've been chairman of a couple of art galleries. I was chairman here at Kettle's Yard for quite a few years. So I've always kept my interest up in that way, and I purchase the work of living artists. So I've kept it up in that sense.
I see, yeah. The other thing, another thing I'd like to know is whether you had any other hobbies, apart from painting at this time, music or any other?
So music, for me, was a very sort of popular level of music. Family background was not classical music, and so the music that I acquired was what every youngster was treating as popular music at the time, even though the word wasn't quite there.
Skiffle.
Yes.
Lonnie Donegan.
That's right. And so, although I didn't really like Elvis Presley as he came along, but that was the sort of music I listened to. Music was always rather peripheral to my life and activities. I think when I finished my undergraduate course, there was a great welling up of interest in the world and the world of philosophy and so on. So I decided to do the PhD, but spent a lot of hours in the library reading the most esoteric books. I mean, I didn't have any guidance on these.
What sort of books? Nietzsche or Schopenhauer or?
Schopenhauer. I never took to Nietzsche. I tried. Feuerbacher. I got to Sartre, and then tried to work back through a bit of Heidegger and back to Husserl. So I became. I suppose Sartre was really what fascinated me at that time, and then the grounding that Sartre himself had. So yes, philosophy, politics. I come to this point where I started writing letters to the newspaper. So
At what age was this?
This is while I was a PhD student. So I was 21, 22. I went to university at 17, graduated at 21, and so straight into my PhD then.
You got onto the theme of politics. I mean, at what point did you notice that there was something odd about the political system of South Africa? I mean, do you remember the first memories of thinking, I wonder, you mentioned being in the factory with black kids and so on. I mean,
so what was very apparent to me from quite an early age was the contrast between the way my mother in particular talked to anyone of black skin and my own understanding of their intellectual abilities. The two just didn't match up at all.
You treated them as children.
She treated them as yes, or worse. And where did that come from? First of all, you sit in the paint factory and you get a 10-minute break for tea. And certainly most people just drink their tea and chatter. But there was this one chap who sat down with the day's crossword puzzle, and he just had 10 minutes, and he had his tea, and he managed to finish that crossword puzzle in his 10 minutes and slam it down with a big smile each time. I just thought, I couldn't possibly do that.
This was a black kid.
Yeah.
Man.
Yeah.
Kid.
Black man. There was another black man, I had to tell my father this, in the paint factory. There was this enormous store of pigments and the titanium dioxide, all the powders that had to be used to make up the paints, and on one side, and all the varnishes and solvents and so on the other side. There was this one man who knew where everything was. There was no catalogue at all. And somebody would come in and say, is there any, it was all coded, is there any P45? And he would say, 5 rows down, along there on the right, and there it would be. And I tried to find a catalogue, there was none, and I was simply told, no, he's the catalogue, there's no point. So, the system actually depended on these characters. Now, I suppose the other side to it is that I did get talking to these people, and this was part of my father's upbringing. And I would sit down and hear their stories. This chap who ran the paint factory in this remarkable way had 5 wives, and he was paid quite well for somebody living in rather undignified circumstances. And so he just said to me, I save money for cows. As soon as I've got enough, I buy another wife. And it was getting into this idea that these people have lives, they have customs and mores within their lives. And I suppose I just learned to respect them. Then we had, in this sense, the man who had the greatest influence on me, who was our chef. One of my father's punishments at the table, if you used a fork the wrong way or something, was to simply send you out to eat in the kitchen. You're not fit to eat with us. So you took your plate and your knife and fork out. And I would sit there talking to the chef, who started telling me the history of his people. And he had been illiterate till he was about 12 or 13, which meant he had this stunning oral tradition memory of the traditions and the stories of his people.
What, do you remember what he was?
He was Zulu.
Zulu.
Right. And so the stories just rolled forward and utterly fascinating. And I actually used to look forward to the moment where I was sent to the kitchen. He also came around to challenge me. This white kid who was brought up with all of the silver spoon.
Literally,
Yes.
metaphorically.
And he would say, well, you do know that the Queen of England is going to live for a very, very long time, but no kings of England live for a long time. Why is that? He said, the kings are given poison so that they live a short time, because the men around them can control the Queen, they can't control the king. So we had these wonderful stories, and then the challenge to your race. You think you guys are smart, but that was one influence. The other major political influence for me, and very serious one, political and religious. So I had been very interested in religion, used to serve in the local church.
What were your
I was
parents?
High Anglican.
Were they Anglican? Your
Yes.
parents?
And St John's College was High Anglican, and so I would help the priest with the incense and the wine and the bread, wearing my little red cassock. And I even did think for a while about going into the priesthood, so I was quite taken with all these ideas. Partly, I think it was the hypocrisy that I began to see around me of people treating black people in a dreadful way, but then appearing to be awfully religious. And partly it was just my philosophical pig-headedness. I couldn't quite get this business at all. What do you mean there's no first cause? If causality is what you're looking for to get back and back. Or there is a first cause, and that is capital F, capital C. So I became very dissatisfied with it, and then joined at university the Rationalist Society. And the man who was president of it was a chap called Professor Eddie Rule, who was professor of botany. So I was in the chemistry department, met Eddie Rule through this, and Eddie had been a member of the Communist Party and a complete thorn in the side of the apartheid regime because he was an Afrikaner. He was one of them, and yet he had joined the Communist Party. Now, this is very much had joined because he left before Hungary, so he left before 56. He left at the beginning of the Stalin pogroms, basically because he received orders from Russia as to who should be eliminated from the South African Communist Party. And he said, how on earth do those people know who's good and who's bad? And so he resigned as a result of that. Eddie wrote a book called Time Longer Than Rope, which is an indictment of the South African apartheid system, and Time Longer Than Rope being the slave song that says, never mind these masters, we'll win in the end. And Eddie was a very big influence, not by direct conversations always, but just by being there, being solid, somebody whose views were rather close to the way mine were developing, and he was real. He wasn't just a book in the library. So I became chairman of the Rationalist Society, and I wrote my first published paper in that time was on the religion and ethics of Albert Schweitzer. And this was out of a conversation with Eddie. I'd been interested in this man Schweitzer, who the great so-called Christian missionary, and I say so-called because when I read about him, I discovered that he had been forbidden from preaching because of his atheistic views. So it was this fascinating notion that he had nevertheless gone out as a missionary to Africa, and everyone regarded him as a Christian missionary. So that piece of work formed the basis of a talk I gave at the university. And it was around this time my entire sort of political and philosophical awakening was this exciting period of my PhD, which was terminated quite quickly. So 2 years into my PhD, I had been a regular writer of letters to the newspaper. The editor of one of his papers, Lawrence Gandar, had actually called me up at one point in the laboratory and said, you haven't written us a letter about this. So I was stimulated even by that to write letters. So this was the national press printing stuff I was writing, even though they were letters. And I was rather excited by that. Um, I had also been reading a fair bit of Bertrand Russell as well. He was quite a big figure at that point. And suddenly I was called in by the special branch and interviewed on the 7th floor of the Grays building in Johannesburg. And it was a terrifying experience, and it was at this point, I suppose, one has to paint in this picture of a country that was democratic, that had a free press. I say democratic, there was only white people who could vote, but nevertheless it had all the trappings of freedom and democracy. And at the same time, with Mandela on the loose, so the African National Congress being banned, Mandela goes underground, sets up in Kontu with Sizwe, the armed resistance movement is formed, and a group of my friends involved in that. So that was a white group. And around the streets of Johannesburg, we began to see these armed vehicles full of armed soldiers. So suddenly, the trappings of a police state were beginning to emerge. But I was writing these letters to the paper thinking I lived in a liberal democracy. The shutters came down on that. I was called up by the special branch in my laboratory, picked up the phone, and this chap just said, "We want to interview you tomorrow. Could you meet us at 3 o'clock?" And gave me the address, and I knew from the address that it was the Grays building where the special branch were based. And at this time, the reason I mentioned the seventh floor is because it was well known that
people fell out of it.
People jumped out of the windows.
They were said to fall out.
There you go. And I was interviewed with a window behind me wide open, with a clunky old tape recorder on the desk, and a very threatening attitude from the chap in front of me. I went into the interview first having said goodbye to my girlfriend. I went to have a haircut, and I knew from several friends who'd gone in for interviews, these were people who'd been involved with the armed resistance movement, but sometimes you didn't come out with a short period of time. And the interview was fairly straightforward. They had a book, they had copies of every single letter I'd published. I don't think they missed a single one. Pasted into this scrapbook, and that somebody had gone through it, underlining phrases, and these phrases were read out to me. And the sum of it was that I was accused of being a communist. And at this point, because of the breakdown in the treason trial, the Minister of Justice was allowed through an Act of Parliament to decide for himself who was a communist. It was no longer a matter of courts. So a 90-day detention had come in and had turned out to be a repeat process where people were let out and then rearrested. So extraordinarily threatening, and I was given the option. Would you like to leave the country? And I said, well, my plan would be to go and do a postdoc in England. And they said, well, that sounds like the attractive option for you. So effectively, I was told, because I said, well, I haven't finished my PhD, they said, well, it wouldn't be much point you're trying to stay beyond 3 more months. I, however, was told not to divulge anything about the conversation. And I handed my PhD thesis in 3 months later, and I had booked my passage on a boat out of Cape Town. Very surprised PhD supervisor, Felix Sever, who accepted it in good heart, and I suspect knew a little bit of what lay behind it. So I was examined in absentia.
One, there's several things that arise out of that, but one was that you've mentioned religion and questioning, and basically you lost your faith in Orthodox Christianity. Quite often with scientists I ask them about whether, particularly a year or two ago when Richard Dawkins' work was at the forefront of everyone's mind, and I've asked, Dr. John Sawston and others, and Professor Polkinghorne and others about their faith. I mean, some of them, the biologists seemed on the whole to find religion and science incompatible. The physicists and cosmologists sort of take a Einsteinian view that there's mysteries out there they can't speak about, so they're a bit more sympathetic. They don't feel there's a real threat or contradiction. I wondered what you felt about whether science disproves religion or not in the Dawkins thesis.
It's interesting, my attitude towards religion is so close to my attitude towards politics.
Mm.
I can't unscramble it.
Mm.
And my personal philosophy as well. I think that I'm not a Richard Dawkins fan. I mean, he writes beautifully, and The Selfish Gene was just marvellous. But I don't like his attitude towards atheism. He sells it too hard for my liking. I think I'm too respectful towards people of religion to take that approach. But at the same time, I think that religion creates so many problems for our societies, and so that's where I come into politics. The situation I saw in South Africa was people from the Dutch Reformed Church who were able to take the view that it was all biblically determined that black people were second-class citizens. On the other hand, at school, I did have an influential man, a priest, who took us in the final year of school into Sophia Town, the black township in Johannesburg, where we could witness at first hand what otherwise none of us had ever seen. We'd lived in the white areas where the only people who were black were servants to the white people. We'd never been in an area where black families lived all on their own, and seen the deprivation. So I saw both sides of what religion was doing. But the divisions between religions have left me feeling very, very cold towards Christianity, or in Christianity and Islam in particular, I would say. It's interesting, for me it was a big revelation going much later on to Japan, to see a very different approach towards religion. People can happily go into a Shinto shrine for an appropriate occasion, or a Buddhist temple, and then turn up in church for Christmas. It's a sort of broad acceptance of what religion has to offer, which we don't have in Europe and America, and I fear in much of the Middle East. So you'll see that my approach to religion is almost a practical one about how do we, humanity, get on with each other.
What did you do about chapel when you were Master of Downing?
That's a very good question. I mean, what I did was, before I was elected to the mastership, I did say that I had no difficulty in attending and speaking at functions in chapel. I had no intention, however, of saying grace, because I felt the words themselves should come from somebody else, and it seemed appropriate that should happen. So
that's grace at meals as well.
Grace at meals.
That's interesting.
I mean, the one piece of this that I suppose I have left out from my childhood that is important. My father also decided that we should be properly bilingual, which didn't mean Zulu and English, for example, but English and Afrikaans, the two languages of the white people. So each of us, my brother and I, were sent separately to live with African families. So in addition to going into the paint business, we were also found time, 2 weeks at a time, to spend on for both of us, a farm. So I spent 2 weeks a year on an Afrikaans farm, and there I not only got to speak Afrikaans rather fluently, but also saw the other side of the white divide in South Africa, and then experienced this amazing doctrinaire attitude towards race, where my friends were brought up with the friends of the chef, all playing together until they were 5 years old, and then, no, you can't play with each other anymore. This was a point of separation, absolutely amazing. And the grace at table was a rant about the separation of the races. I'm sure it was intended for my benefit, but the politics and religion in South Africa was so closely linked in, which I suppose is why I still link the two together.
Well, let's move now to perhaps to England. You're coming here. You came here with your wife to do a postdoc Liverpool
At Imperial College.
Imperial College. Yeah.
Yeah. So here was the irony. I managed to have time to apply for a postdoctoral fellowship immediately after my interview with the special branch. I had already got an application in for a Shell fellowship, and at this point the Shell fellowship was the great fellowship to get out of South Africa, to come to Britain. And I was interviewed, and I won the fellowship, and so I arrived on my feet. I was kicked out of the country, but landed on my feet. I could have chosen to go to Oxford, Cambridge, or Imperial College, but I knew Professor of Physical Chemistry at Cambridge because he had lectured in Johannesburg, and he was very close to my own field of study. So I ended up as a postdoc at Imperial College.
Did you say you knew the one at Cambridge, or did you mean you knew the one at Imperial College?
Sorry, Imperial.
Yeah.
Imperial College.
So that's why you went there rather than the others. Yes. And how was that? I mean, can you remember arriving in England, the cold and all of the misery of it all?
Yeah. No, I tell you, I arrived in England in September 1963, and the brilliant day out there now. It was a brilliant sunny day. And so all of our expectations, all of the South Africans on the boat saying, oh, it's going to be terrible. We stepped off the boat into this brilliant sunshine. It was one of those lovely autumn days in Southampton. Greeted most curiously by a customs officer who looked at my exit papers and said, South African, welcome, he said. I think you've got a wonderful Prime Minister. At that point, of course, on the boat, we had all our belongings, and so there was this massive pile of stuff that we had to get up to London, and London itself was just the most exciting place for me to be. First of all, this great weight off my shoulders. I was no longer feeling as if I could be put away at any moment. I was really in a fairly paranoid state by the time I left, and it was just wonderful. I felt free, and then I had to look for a flat, and was simply astounded. I thought this was the land of true liberalism I'd come to. When I had to find a place to live, my wife and I, and every card posted onto the coffee bars and everything that advertised the place said, no blacks or Irish need apply. I thought, goodness me, that was pretty shocking. But London, if you imagine this for a young man emerging from South Africa at this point, it was the swinging place to be, as it happened. The Beatles had arrived, and the short skirts had arrived, and London was it. It was the real focus of this new age. So it was very exciting. I got back to painting. I did life classes. I dived into my work at Imperial College, and I read philosophy avidly. So it was a wonderful period. Toured around Europe and did the South African thing of visiting every country to tick it off. But my tour of Europe was a tour of art galleries. If you imagine a young man who loves art, but I had never seen an original Van Gogh, take an extreme example. I'd only seen prints. And then to see the three-dimensionality of Vincent van Gogh's paintings was just amazing. I was spellbound, just taken in by it. All of his stuff then was housed in the Kröller-Müller Museum, some miles outside Amsterdam. The current Van Gogh Museum is beautiful, stunning, but I still loved that museum because that's where I first saw his original work. And I literally went from one art gallery around Europe to the next in this great sense of wonderment and excitement.
Lovely. And what was your postdoc, the subject of your postdoc?
So in a sense it was a continuation of what I'd been doing in Johannesburg. My PhD thesis was on catalysis, the ammonia synthesis reaction, and a very important reaction, of course. Fixation of nitrogen was very important to develop fertilizers to feed the world. So very important topic, and ever since 1917 no improvement had been produced in the industrial catalyst, and I have to say, even today. So despite all my 45 years later, the same catalyst is still the best. But our understanding of how catalysts work has just been totally transformed over that period. So we were simply throwing different materials into the reactor and trying them out. Now I say that, but I was always driven by the need to understand how these catalysts work. And so the rest of my research has been around understanding how solid surfaces can cause molecules to react together with each other to produce different products. So the Japanese word for catalyst is shokubai, which is marriage broker.
Is it?
Right, so it's the same word as marriage broker.
Very interesting.
Right, it's a beautiful description because it's a molecular marriage broker. Brings molecules together, gets them to react to produce infinite products. I started from the difficult end, just trying to make better catalysts for ammonia synthesis, and then arrived in London and said to my supervisor, we've got to try and improve the apparatus, the instruments to manage this process. So we designed a new instrument and started measuring things a lot more accurately. And the rest of my life has been around measuring things more accurately and then developing theories, taking it from the best available state of quantum theory to see if we could calculate these properties accurately. So I've gone from the extraordinarily difficult to every atom and molecule being understood what their functions were and being in control, and then back to the more complicated but maintaining that high level of understanding. So the postdoc was with F.C. Tompkins. I was the only one who was allowed to use his first name. I was the only one who was invited around to his place for dinner. And we used to talk politics and philosophy, and it was tremendous. Very shy man, actually. And one of the world's leaders in the field. And so he taught me an awful lot. I mean, that was just such a sharp learning curve compared with where I was when I arrived. And actually from then on, it it's just been I've been independently driven by that period at Imperial College, and I subsequently had 3 years later a sabbatical period at the National Bureau of Standards in Washington, which was my next big step forward.
Arrived in America for a sort of sabbatical.
Yeah.
What were you doing there?
I was working as a visiting expert at the National Bureau of Standards, working in the Surface Science Laboratory, in particular working with 2 equally young, raring-to-go scientists, John Yates and Ted Mabey. And at that time in the National Bureau of Standards, as often happens purely by chance, there was just this, it became a meeting place of 4 or 5 of us who were the young Turks in the field, each one of us feeling that we were opening the field up in a totally new direction. So taking a study which had been always macroscopic, we knew what the temperature was, what the product reaction rate was, we knew what the catalyst was in terms of its solid properties. We had no atomic or electronic understanding of what was happening. So what we were developing was a new methodology, which was quite challenging because surfaces form a very tiny proportion of a given piece of matter. And we were not going to work with very high surface area materials, where the proportion of the matter that is surface is much greater, but with pieces of material that look rather like a 1-penny coin. And so we had a very tiny number of atoms that we were trying to work on. So defining these atoms with atomic resolution was going to be our challenge. So we had to take techniques. If you look at crystallography, it had been developed through the development of X-ray techniques. Now X-rays go right through the solid, and that is their great beauty, and they give you the average structure of the solid. But they're, by that definition, absolutely no use for the surface, because the surface is just a transparent part of the process. So we had to use techniques based around electrons that would be reflected back by the solid, and start working with a whole series of techniques using photons, electrons, helium ions, all sorts of new techniques, and then taking old techniques, infrared spectroscopy was one of them, and developing these old techniques in new ways so that we could apply them. And we became, I think, a rather obstreperous group of young people. So we formed what was called, in a very American way, a surface science for lunch bunch. And we would go through the paper of somebody who was still living in their macroscopic world and pull it to bits. And then we would invite them over to give us a talk and then tear them apart. And we seemed to get a lot of pleasure out of this process. So it was unpleasant in a way, but what it taught me was that the business of challenge, which I know I always had all my life, was central to good science. That whatever you did in the challenge process, even if at the end of the day you totally agreed with the person you were challenging, the whole thing was made more robust through that challenge process. So we all had the same rather aggressive approach to challenge, and it worked very well. So I mean, I can now look back on that as a massive springboard in the development of surface science. It's not as if we were the only ones doing it. There were other groups emerging at the same time in different parts of the world. But certainly I think that I could say that there were 3 or 4 people who really were responsible for developing modern surface science, and that springboard was a big part of that.
And you're an odd paradox, because you speak very gently and you seem a very gentle sort of person, And yet you're representing yourself as, quite pugnacious and almost aggressive and questioning. And it probably is that combination which made you such a successful chief scientific officer, because when you're dealing with someone like Tony Blair and others, if you're just a bullying type, it won't work at all. If you can be rolled over, it won't work at all. And it's this combination of steely resolve and obstreperousness, as you put it, with, a mildish manner, which you need. Do you think that's fair?
I think it probably is fair, but I think what you've got to feed into that is, I'm particularly in the period when I was in America. I'm talking about a period when I was quite an aggressive young man, so I've matured into what you see in front of me now.
Oh, right. Okay, well, let's come back to this country then again. Is that when you went to Liverpool?
So I was at Imperial College for 3 years, again, very exciting years, then went to the University of East Anglia.
Oh, that's right.
My first teaching post was as a lecturer at the University of East Anglia in chemical physics, where I was thrown into the deep end. You'll do first year thermodynamics. Imagine this new university, new bunch of people. You'll do thermodynamics, you'll do spectroscopy. And at the end of the first year, the head of physical chemistry, a lovely man, Norman Shepherd, called me into his office and said, the lowest marks in the examination in chemistry were for your course on thermodynamics. You managed to pass 2 students, and the rest are all fails. I think you need to re-examine how you teach thermodynamics. And this was a big awakening for me, and again, critically important, was the realization that I had to understand as if I was the student rather than as if I was just broadcasting. And I spent 2 months preparing my thermodynamics course. I re-evaluated the whole business of teaching thermodynamics, which is a very mathematical and abstract part of a physics or chemistry course, but it can be made much less abstract by dwelling on concepts. And so I began to develop a new mode of teaching thermodynamics, which was to capture interest around concepts and then develop the mathematics behind it. This sometimes horrified my colleagues. So one of my essays that I set for the students, and setting essays wasn't common in thermodynamics, was to give them a cartoon I'd found from the New Yorker of a man running up a steep slope, followed by a boulder that was rolling up the slope after him. And my essay simply said, discuss. So, the notion of energy conservation, second law of thermodynamics and entropy, all of that was bound into this cartoon. And for these young people, this was fascinating. Entropy was often seen to be the ultimate in the abstract concept. And I had to start by explaining to them that I thought energy was a much more difficult idea than entropy. And that was a way in which I could capture their interest. Now, the reason I'm emphasizing this before you get me to Liverpool is that this was a very important step in terms of my eventually becoming a chief scientific advisor. This was the ability to explain and capture the interest of people. And I do think that I hadn't even got close to that when I arrived at the University of East Anglia. 8 years later, I think I had honed that into something that was really worthwhile.
And you enjoyed teaching?
I thoroughly enjoyed teaching. All my life, the privilege of being a teacher, researcher in the university, interacting with these bright young people has just been what has made my life so pleasant.
Which part of it do you like most or least? I mean, did you go through the supervision? I mean, when you came to Cambridge, certainly 1-to-1, 1-to-2 kind of supervision.
Yeah, I came to Cambridge quite late, and so by the time I came to Cambridge, I was head of physical chemistry and didn't do much supervision at all. I only did supervision because I wanted to do it. I was at St John's College, and not because I was required to supervise at all. So at both at the University of East Anglia and the University of Liverpool, my teaching was all in smaller groups, but maybe 10, 12 students at a time. But I really enjoyed all of those times. Interestingly, not so much in the practical laboratories, that was a bit of a chore, whereas the discussions and this notion of saying, well, these concepts don't only apply to what you've got on the bench there. These concepts apply to the real world that we live in, and we can bring a lot of them back to the bench. So the teaching of thermodynamics, spectroscopy, quantum mechanics, statistical mechanics, all of these things was a big learning process for me. You know, what I thought I understood when I was an undergraduate, I realized as I moved on, had been a very superficial grasp of how it all worked. And by the time I got into government, I think I had developed this into an overall view of science. And I realized although I was trained as a chemical physicist, I could use these concepts applied to virtually any aspect of science.
And were you interested in the history and philosophy of science as a subject?
I was interested in the philosophy of science, and this then drew me into the history rather than the other way around. And I think the philosophy of science, however, also led me to the limitations of science. This doesn't take me into religion; it rather takes me into the world of existentialism, closer to Buddhist than any other form of religion.
That's interesting. Let's just return to your actual central work as a research scientist before we get on to politics and government. You may not want to comment on this, but certainly in the Wikipedia article on it, there's a dark allusion to the fact that there were three of you, and I've forgotten the other two names, who were working on a very, very important theory, and in the end, one of you, or three of you, got a Nobel Prize, and you didn't. We were referred to an article about this, which I hadn't seen. Can you explain? That was obviously one of the more important pieces of work you've done.
You obviously ought to read Wikipedia, but certainly I was honoured by the University College London with an honorary degree, and the orator did say there were three people who have been attributed with developing modern surface science, King, Ertl and Sanajai, of whom only Ertl got the Nobel Prize. So that would match up with what you're saying.
Yes. What was that? Is that what the work that you were describing earlier? Really?
Yes. No, that is my lifetime's work. So even beginning back in South Africa with my PhD and not being happy with that rather macroscopic and rough view of the world. The analogy, by the way, is easy to make with biology and molecular biology.
Yes.
So this was taking catalysis from that rough description into an atomic view of what was happening. And I used that as a model for developing modern surface science. So the three of us, Gabor, Sanajai, Gerhard Ertl and myself are close friends, and nothing would change that. And we have interacted with each other over a period of many decades. The field has undergone a massive transformation to the point where in the laboratory here in Cambridge today, I've just been looking at the latest study of the structure of water molecules on a metal surface, where we have managed to pinpoint where all the oxygen atoms and hydrogen atoms are in quite a complex structure. And why am I excited about this? Because water molecules have evaded aided our ability to work on them until just the last couple of years, the culmination being this wonderful revelation this morning. Water molecules are very difficult because we had to use electrons so that we got surface sensitivity, but electrons were breaking the molecules down before we could determine their structure. So we had to develop a piece of equipment that was about 1 million times more sensitive than previous equipment. And this is our first result emerging from that. That little description there is just one step of what we've been doing all this time. It's continually refining techniques and then managing to work at the limits of sensitivity. It's not, I mean, part of it has been the excitement of imaging atoms, imaging and manipulating individual atoms. So that in itself, people writing words with atoms, which is a bit of fun. But that in itself just signifies this amazing transformation. We have these, we are unique here in Cambridge in pulling together development of new instruments and development of new theory. So we bring both state-of-the-art together, quantum theory and development of new instruments, each pushing the other. So the state of the quantum theory is so good that sometimes I'm not sure which is more accurate, the experiment or the theory. And therefore, the whole object of the game is to try and develop ways of using surfaces in the computer and then taking that knowledge back into the laboratory and making something work. So for example, car exhaust system is a dreadful poisonous piece of apparatus. The combustion engine is awful. So emitting carbon monoxide, suicides would just attach a hose pipe and put in the car to kill themselves. And we were filling the air with it. The cities like Los Angeles and San Francisco disappearing under a haze of automobile exhaust, basically. Now, what is in the back end of the modern car exhaust is the catalytic system, which converts these noxious gases into harmless gases. That's what we've been working on trying to improve, but using fundamental knowledge rather than just random trials. Yes, so there is that story about the Nobel Prize, which is very recent and therefore quite raw.
Okay, well, we'll probably leave it at that. I was struck when you were talking that of memories of interviewing Lord Rees, Martin Rees, because he very forcefully said that the improvements in measurement techniques and technology of observation as an astronomer had been what had really driven the advances in astronomy in the last 20, 30, 40 years. It sounds as if that's the case with you as well.
Absolutely astonishing. The idea 40 years ago that we would be able to image every single atom in the surface, actually image each atom, would have been a total dream. In other words, you would have been declared mad if you thought you could ever achieve that. Just to get some average property of these surface atoms was already a dream. But to pick them out individually and then actually not just pick them out, but measure their properties one at a time. So yes, this is the equivalent of better instrumentation in astronomy.
One sort of last question in this sort of area. I often ask distinguished scientists if they were giving advice to a young scientist about how to do as well as they possibly could. I mean, some of them say don't go into science, but others have some fruits of their years. And I was wondering if you advised to a young scientist, what one or two points would you make to them?
If I was to give advice to a young scientist, I would certainly categorize my advice in two different ways. One is, how do you optimize your own ability to develop your talents? And so that would be a very general piece of advice, and I suspect would apply to almost any area of study. you need to follow your own interests, and at the same time attach yourself to a master, become an apprentice to an expert. That is, I think, critically important, because you can be utterly brilliant, and you may well find the right texts to read and so on, and through that develop into a brilliant scientist. But the shortcut is to develop your trade through an apprenticeship. So my attitude towards a PhD studentship is that it is a period of apprenticeship. I never would abandon a PhD student in the corner of a lab to sort out the PhD all by themselves. I think it's critically important to surround them with an intellectual environment which is continually challenging and developing their ability. But the second part of my advice would be, what would be the best areas to get into today? And I'm fairly clear about this, in the sense that you could choose to go into particle physics if you're a brilliant mathematical-minded physicist. Go to CERN, hope that after CERN there's going to be the next stage of CERN, an even bigger accelerator, eventually perhaps one going right round the planet. And I suspect you might discover that humanity is getting less and less interested in going further and further back in time. In other words, we've now got to sub-microsecond after the Big Bang. There's no stopping that. You can go back to a millionth of a second, from a millionth to a billionth of a second to a trillionth of a second. There's no stopping that. You can keep working at higher energies. I think we know enough about that, frankly, and especially given the enormous cost in terms of talented people and the cost of building the equipment. So I would rather say, look at what is challenging humanity today. We have a completely new set of challenges, all arising from the fact that by mid-century we'll be 9 billion people on this planet. We will have run out of a whole bunch of resources that we're all taking for granted at the moment, and at the same time those 9 billion people will therefore have to manage with a more restricted set of resources. And then there's another bunch of resources we're totally mismanaging, in particular the atmosphere and the ocean, but also land. We can recover land a little more easily. There I'm setting out a set of challenges, whether you're interested in the life sciences, the physical sciences, engineering. I'm suggesting that your talents can be best made use of by moving into one of these very demanding areas. How do we, if you're an economist, how do we move into a new design of economics or attitude towards economics in which we look at sustainability as the most important thing, rather than GDP growth, which is what we've had for many years. If we're looking at physics and engineering, what do we use as alternatives to energy sources from fossil fuels? Yes, we've got nuclear energy, we've got solar energy, we've got wind, we've got geothermal energy. How do we mine those forms of energy efficiently for all of our uses? If we look at the question of mobility, how do we get around? Now, each of these problems may sound very practical, but each one of these has a fundamental edge to it, so you can tackle these at any level. Those are my two approaches to it.
Well, that's very interesting. Leads on perhaps to a question I usually ask is, how do you work? That is to say, some people go for long walks and suddenly ideas pop into their heads, others sit in the bath or listen to music or sit and work in labs. I mean, not necessarily eureka moments, but what is most conducive to your personal thinking?
I think obsessiveness. So I suspect the common trait of the scientist is obsessiveness. So we scientists may even have a tendency towards Asperger's, but we can really focus on problems. And I certainly am not dog with a bone. Give me a problem and I haven't solved it. And it's in my mind constantly. So I may appear to be having a meal with a group of friends, but actually in the back of my mind this is still there. So I do think that sort of obsessiveness is absolutely vital. I don't actually know what happens when I'm obsessed with a problem. It's not as if I am feeling as if I'm totally focused on it. I'm aware of it, and I know because there's a kind of sense of tension and frustration. But what does emerge is best described as a eureka moment, because there's a point of clarity with which it all seems to fall into place. And when I was younger, that used to come as a complete surprise. Now it doesn't happen quite so instantaneously. I can see it all emerging more slowly now. But my greatest eureka moment was sitting with some stunning results. So that means unexpected, so requiring a new explanation. And PhD student Alison Crossley, who's based in Oxfordshire, and we're still in contact with each other. 1975 this was, Liverpool. And we had been sitting until 10 in the evening, all day, trying to sort this out. Couldn't sort it out. And 4 o'clock in the morning I woke up and there it was. And I had to get up and write it down. And then I just couldn't sit there because I wanted to go and tell him. But the decent thing was to wait until a decent hour. So I waited until 7 a.m. jumped in my car and drove into town. I'm afraid at quite a speed, so I was stopped by a policeman and received a speeding fine. I was so elated, I didn't mind one little bit.
What a lovely story. Rather like that famous mathematician Ramanujan, or whoever it was, whose solutions came usually at about 4 in the morning from some Hindu goddess or something.
Right.
And of course you know Newton's remark when he was asked how he'd done what he did. And he said, by thinking on it all the time.
Right.
Or thinking on't all the time.
But for most of us, I suspect it's not that you're consciously trying to think of it all the time, but that you can't let it go.
As with Poincaré's descriptions of scientific, he's not thinking about the problem formally, but then suddenly he realizes he has been thinking about it. Let's now, that was fascinating, let's now go to your involvement with government. Where should we start? When you became Chief Scientific Officer, or
Title is Chief Scientific Advisor.
Advisor, yeah.
And it was in October 2000.
Mm-hmm.
All very short notice. Offered the job in July 2000. Please could you start in October? I was Master of Downing, Head of Chemistry at Cambridge, and it didn't seem possible, and I wasn't even sure it was desirable. Looking at a job in government was a total black box to me. I had been completely engrossed by my work in Cambridge. So being Master of College, Head of a department, and I had a research group of 25 people, was taking up all my time, and I had avoided taking any jobs in government or research councils or whatever. So I had no preparation for this apart from my government experience against government, if you like, in South Africa, when I came out into this country, for a period I worked for the Association of University Teachers, and when I was professor at Liverpool I became president of the Association of University Teachers. So I had that sort of political inclination, and that was what created the interest. I was headhunted for the post, accepted, and part-time started 1st of October, relinquished all my work except the research, including chairmanship of Kettle's Yard, from January the 1st, 2001. So it was really full-time from January the 1st, 2001. My major objective was to try to get governments moving on the issue of climate change, which I told all my friends, including Gabriel Horn. What I immediately did was set about a study of the state of energy research in the United Kingdom. So there was this fascinating discovery that here we were about to go into a period when we needed to find alternative forms of energy other than fossil fuel based, and yet our report showed that energy research had totally collapsed. We had the biggest energy research laboratory in Europe, which was the Central Electricity Generating Board Research Laboratory, and the Gas Board also had a research laboratory that was big and well known. When electricity and gas were privatised, the casualty that had hardly been picked up was that all of the utilities that were formed immediately shut down the research laboratories they inherited. We all know they sweated their assets in economic terms. So the capability for research in Britain had more or less come grinding to a halt. That was the outcome of this piece of work. But just when we were getting this underway, we had the foot and mouth disease epidemic, which began in, well, we now know it began on February the 23rd, is the closest date we can put it to, in 2001. I got involved in about March the 7th, March the 10th, reading the newspapers actually, and thinking, was this what the Chief Scientific Advisor's job was about? It was all being handled within what was then the Ministry of Agriculture, Food and Fisheries, and they had their own scientist, they had the Chief Veterinary Officer, and I thought I should leave them to operate on their own. But as I watched this epidemic take off around the country and saw that it was just growing exponentially, I thought maybe I ought to take an active interest. And John Krebs, now Lord Krebs, and I got together a team of people who are partly government people and partly external to government, professors. And we just discussed what was happening and decided what we needed to do was to model the thing. Just as an interesting aside, my interest in solid surfaces, molecules on solid surfaces, had taken me to one piece of work we'd done on the way molecules move around surfaces. And this rather elaborate model that we had published in the 1980s, I now realized was rather like a virus moving around farms. Farms are two-dimensional, like surfaces. Quaintly, on average, a British farmer's got 5 nearest neighbours, by which I mean it has a contiguous boundary with the first neighbour. And we were able to set up models, both all farm, all animal models in the computer. This was done by a Cambridge group, not my own, and a simple model that was based on the sort of algebra I'd been developing, which was based on how many near neighbours there were to a given site on a surface or a farmland on land. The two models gave much the same results, so we were able to have a theoretical description of this epidemic in its early stages. We then therefore knew what the rate of infectivity was going from infected farm to the neighbouring farms and to the next neighbour circle of farms and so on. And from that analysis we very quickly realised that this epidemic was completely different from the 1967-68 epidemic in Britain. That epidemic had been very heavily driven by wind-borne disease, and essentially the reason it turns out is because it was driven by pigs, and pigs yield actually from both ends of the animal a very large cloud of aerosol that carries the virus, that gets up into the wind, and the wind. So the direction of the wind was critical to deciding where the next farms were that were vulnerable. In the 2001 epidemic, however, it must have been animals virtually touching across fences that was causing it, because the epidemic was spreading locally from one farm to the next. So I realized that what MAF had done, the ministry had done, was simply take out the lessons learned from the 67-68 epidemic and applied them, and they were not actually relevant. The other thing we learnt was that the epidemic, instead of just growing as it was and developed by wind directions, would suddenly pop up all over the country. And that turned out to be non-random. In essence, it meant animals were sent to, animals were born on a farm somewhere. They were then sent off to be fattened somewhere else, as young animals, sent off somewhere else because the season had changed and they'd be better off at the bottom of the hills rather than the top. And they were sent to large distances around the country. This hadn't happened in 67-68. So farming has become a very much more honed practice in which the farmers are optimizing the development of their animals and preparing them for market. And so much more animal movement. Total surprise to MAF, who were using models based on 67-68. So all of our modelling revealed these surprises, and we began to understand what was happening. And we now had a computer program in which we could try different strategies for bringing this thing to an end. And within that computer program, the PC model could be just run very quickly. We were using the big Cambridge model as a way of just checking that we were getting results that on the simple PC model that were good. So March 22nd, I went in to see the Prime Minister, and this was my first meeting with the Prime Minister. Say, you've got
this was Tony Blair.
Yes, you've got this epidemic running. This is what's happening. But Prime Minister, we've done the analysis, and we can switch it off in 2 days. We can turn exponential rise to exponential decay within 2 days, if you follow the procedure we've used in our models. And the procedure was, as soon as a farm goes down with a disease, you send in a vet. If the vet confirms what the farmer thinks, then you immediately take the animals out. Don't take a blood sample. Take a blood sample, but don't wait until it's been analysed. You take those animals out immediately. But as soon as the sample's been analysed, and that would take typically 6 days, as soon as it's been analysed and you find it's positive, confirms what the vet thinks, you now immediately take all of the near neighbour farms out. Because by that time, a good number of those animals are already developing the virus. But if we do that, we can virtually stop the spread of this disease, because this is the way it behaves in the computer. Well, the Prime Minister was quite pleased.
Imagine.
So he called together a meeting of COGLA down in the basement, and so all departments represented, and I said, right, tell them what's going to be done. And he said, I'm putting you in charge now. Let's see, you have a science meeting every day, report to me morning and evening, and off we went. We did actually have the sense, fortunately, to have an army expert do logistical modelling for us. And I was able to say, Prime Minister, today you've got 45 new infected farms reported across England and Wales. And in 9 days' time, if you carry on the way we're going at the moment, you will have 90. I'm giving you a route forward which will turn this around within 2 days. By the time that's happened, we will have peaked at about 50 new farms and then we'll drop. If we get beyond 60, the Army tell us that they have not got the capacity to carry through the operation we're planning. So we need to operate right away. And that was it. That was it. I was immediately, that next day, I was sent out onto television and radio by the Prime Minister to explain why policy had changed. What I didn't realise the first time I went on radio was that the Minister for Agriculture, Food and Fisheries...
John Gummer, is it?
No, it wasn't. This was Tony Blair's minister.
Oh, yes.
Brown.
Oh, yes.
Not Gordon Brown.
Mm.
Why have I forgotten his first name? Perhaps I'm blocking it. So he had gone out on a big press conference, radio, television cameras flying, saying, it's all right, everything's under control. And my very first television appearance, I went out saying, this is out of control at the moment, but we need to follow the following procedures to get it under control, and we will get it under control within 2 days. And the person interviewing me said, but we've just had the minister saying it's perfectly under control. So I had to explain that out of control was a scientific statement, that the R0 term for the epidemic was actually greater than 1. That is, for each new infected farm going down today, tomorrow there'd be more than 1 new infected farm. And the disease under control, tomorrow there'd be less than 1. And so I had to use science to explain the difference. And the minister was saying it's all under control because our process would bring it under control.
Well done.
The upshot, however, was we brought it under control. I showed my curves on television, predicting how this would go. Richard Wilson called me in, head of the civil service, and said, David, do you know what's happening? I said, well, I think I've got it all under control. And he said, no, I mean, you are in a very dangerous personal position because you're being sent out to explain what's being done. There's no politician out there next year. If this doesn't work, then they can all point to you and say, it was his advice that didn't work. I said, Richard, I'm pretty confident. We've gone through all this. Anyway, the data points came in, and I'm very pleased to say the data points followed our curve amazingly well, far too well. The date of the general election was due on May the 5th. Everyone knew that year. And it was delayed until, I think it was June the 7th or 8th. And I know that date was chosen on the basis of my curves, because May the 5th the epidemic would have been very high, but by June the 7th we have it fully under control. So I think it is the first time the date of a general election has been chosen on the basis of scientific calculation.
What a lovely story. And this obviously must have pleased your master, Tony Blair, and had you already started, well, you hadn't met him, but had you tried to put climate change at the front of scientific endeavour at that point, or was it later after this, and harvesting the goodwill of this, that you managed to persuade him?
As a matter of fact, my first trip to Washington was just after President Bush had declared that Kyoto was dead, which I believe was early February 2001. So actually I went to Washington as the foot and mouth disease epidemic began, but unwittingly. I think the amusing bit about the trip was it was both to deal with Bush's anger over Europe declaring that they didn't want any American food that contained genetically modified foodstuffs. He claimed that was a trade barrier, and I had to go over and explain that Britain, for a starter, was going to make a lot of money out of genetically modified foodstuffs. We in Cambridge had invented molecular biology and planned to make good use of what we'd invented, and at the same time I needed to explain why it was that Kyoto shouldn't be dead. I went on this mission with a man called Michael Arthur, and so my first mission was called the King Arthur mission. And we went into the White House, and we were very politely received on both issues, and I did meet a whole range of highly positioned people in the cabinet. I didn't meet George Bush at the time, but his personal advisors. We were given a very polite hearing, and on both issues, however, there was a pretty negative response. So I was already beginning to move. The Prime Minister asked me to go to deal with the GM question, and I asked if I could add the climate change issue as well. I think it would be fair to say that Blair's focus from science was on the science, innovation, wealth creation agenda. And so in that first year, 2001, I persuaded him to do a speech. I think it's the first full 1-hour speech any Prime Minister has given to the Royal Society on science. And he gave his speech under the title of Science Matters. And so I was heavily involved in the preparation of that speech, and saw Tony Blair in his most astonishing speech-making capability at first hand. So the speech took 3 or 4 months to prepare. There was a team of 3 or 4 of us involved in the preparation, and he was involved in discussions with us roughly once a month in the lead up to the speech. And then in the last 2 nights before the speech, he began rewriting it, despite his own engagement in it. And as he often did, the night before the actual speech, stayed up until the early hours of the morning. Those amazing speeches that he gave, he put an awful lot of effort into. And so he would rewrite and then virtually memorize as he went through that process. Now the science, he did read a fair bit more of the speech out than he normally does. But nevertheless, this was the big statement that Britain was extraordinarily strong in the science space, and we needed to keep building it up at twice the rate of our GDP growth. And so the commitment that the science space would be funded at twice the rate of GDP growth was included then. And the speech talks a lot about how molecular biology was invented here and how we should benefit from the technologies that emerge. I think for me the fascinating thing was that the following year Premier Wen Jiabao from China had a state visit, and he was of course seeing the Queen and the Prime Minister, and from the embassy came a message, and he would like to meet the Government Chief Scientific Advisor. Now, needless to say, in the list, the food chain in Britain, I was very much at the bottom, and so it was a little surprising that he was requesting to meet me. And in the end, I met him on a Sunday. It didn't happen officially. And I did take a group of vice-chancellors along with me. But he did tell me, when I asked why he'd asked to meet me. I mean, first of all, for a Chinese Prime Minister, it's not a surprise to be the chief scientist. Half of his Politburo are engineers or scientists. Science has a very high status in China. But secondly, it turns out Science Matters had been translated into Chinese, and he said, we have altered Chinese policy to match what was written there, and I wanted to talk to the man who had advised his Prime Minister down this route. So this began a very strong relationship that I maintained with the Chinese. much stronger than with the Bush regime, actually, over the following years. It meant that I brought China into the world's biggest ever technological project, the ITER project, which became my big baby. It meant that I was able to advise them on climate change. We took our team who developed Britain's approach to adapting to the challenges of climate change, in flood and coastal defences. We took our team out to China to work in the area around Shanghai, the Yangtze Basin area. And I have personally no doubt that what turned the Politburo's decision-making on climate change around 2.5 years ago was receiving a report from their own scientists, engineers and economists on the impact on the Yangtze Basin area. Shanghai, by the end of the century, if the world doesn't manage this problem, goes underwater. Flooding from the Yangtze and flooding from ocean, sea levels rising, would make it unmanageable. That beginning with meeting up with Premier Wen Jiabao on his state visit here has led to quite a fruitful outcome in terms of
only yesterday, I think, the Chinese announced their emissions targets. Yes.
So I've been into Beijing this year, and I had put the idea to a rather astonished climate change advisor to the President and the Premier, that if he and President Obama were able to stand on a platform together and declare what needs to be done with climate change, the rest of the world would follow. Now, it didn't quite happen that way because President Obama couldn't, without his Senate approving, reach that point. But it came pretty close.
It's getting closer, which is something. I mean, this is slightly off the point, but I did an interview with Richard Friend, and he talked about his work with plastics and energy capture from solar energy using a much cheaper form of capturing material, which you will know about. I mean, that seems a very promising direction. You know that you know about this.
I more than know about it, in the sense that I got Richard Friend to make a presentation to the Prime Minister on this, and I have been pressing to create. You see, I think this is so important that it's worth the British government investing taxpayers' money in setting up a sufficient investment into the base around Cambridge to enable these spin-out companies that are developing these ideas to really compete at the world level. I think what we've always missed in the past is backing really good ideas by British government funding. Now, we've got several hundred million going into this now. And my hope is that it's not only plastic photovoltaics, which will be far cheaper than silicon-based photovoltaics, but it's also plastic-based computer hardware. They can actually eliminate silicon from future computers.
I mean, he showed me his reader as well, the one that's coming out in January. You know, this extraordinary flat roll-up thing. And I also interviewed Herman Hauser, who has backed him, and he showed me the device. I mean, it seems such an exciting area.
I honestly think that if we get this right, this will ensure the financial future of the United Kingdom. I mean, we won't need to survive with bankers doing what they do.
And also save the planet, hopefully, on the way.
And also save the planet. I mean, I think the idea of being able to cover every building with material that turns solar energy into electricity. This is a bit unfortunate.
So I didn't record that. If we could coat all these buildings, and also, as Richard Friend said, you know, a small state like Kansas covered with this stuff would provide all the power for America. if you had, and the Chinese are quite interested in this, I think, you had sort of 4 or 5 of these areas covered, plus all the buildings and cars and everything. I mean, you have free, non-polluting energy. It's the problem of storing it and distributing it, of course, but...
So, the Chinese, I've been introduced to the man who is in charge of energy for China. This is the way China operates. So I had been sat in front of members of the Politburo and a range of civil servants for a few hours and asked to advise them how to manage climate change. This is a few years ago. And obviously when I was in government and could say nothing about it. And I had essentially told them to do what we introduced in Britain in 2004 and what was rolled out into Europe, which is cap and trade. You put a cap on every nation and you trade carbon dioxide between nations. I said, do it across China and it's your way of taking control of energy. You've got very inefficient energy usage processes in place, and this will drive through alternative energy sources from fossil fuels. And I came back in February this year and met him, and he said, we think you didn't quite understand that we are not a capitalist economy. I said, what do you mean? He said, we have top-down decision making. I've been told what is the maximum amount of coal I can use in any given year, and I have to find alternatives. So he said, that's my job. And if the Politburo tells you to do that, you deliver. So I said, how are you doing it? He said, we are now the world's biggest producer of photovoltaics. So they just switch it on and away they go. They have under construction, nearly completed, a 1 billion watt power station, which is entirely photovoltaic.
Gosh.
They're covering a piece of the desert, and this is using silicon-based photovoltaics. Now, if you took Richard Friend's plastic photovoltaics, you could do that everywhere.
Exactly.
At a tiny fraction of the cost to the Chinese government. I think, and just to finish the Chinese side of the story, they've now, of course, got the world's biggest program of building new nuclear power stations. So they're facing up to the alternatives. Energy efficiency, that was the announcement the day before yesterday from President Hu Jintao. They are totally caught up now in managing the problem of growing their economy and decreasing their dependence on fossil fuels. The idea of using plastics has so many attractions. It's lowering the cost, it's attractive for architects to use on the outside of buildings. Plastics come in all forms and shapes and colours, and it also means that we can hope to develop ceramics, tiles that are photovoltaic. We can hope to develop paint that is photovoltaic. So what we can do is convert quite a high percentage of the sunlight hitting the planet into the energy we need, and the problem is virtually solved.
If we can get Richard said the problem at the moment was getting the capture ratio up from about 7% to about 15-16%, which is what
15 to 20 would be absolutely great.
But he seemed to think this is feasible.
Well, if you think of the amount of work that's been done on silicon today by thousands of people, and how little work has been done on the plastic materials, you can be pretty sure it's right.
We've only got 3 minutes left. Is there anything you'd really like me to ask you about? I haven't asked you about Tony Blair and the Iraq War. Perhaps we should leave that at the moment. But is there something we haven't talked about damming and your mastership there? But what would be your final choice?
I think I've had the most amazingly privileged existence. Not only working with all these young people and all their attributes and being kept lively and young through that, but living in this place, Cambridge, and then I'm now also living in Oxford, experiencing government from within making friends with the most surprising people. Gorbachev, who's I see as two of the greatest political characters of the 20th century who really made a transformed world possible, were Nelson Mandela, showing that you could have a transformation without violence, and Gorbachev, who's we're just celebrating 20 years of the Berlin Wall coming down. Who would have believed it would ever come down? And the breakup of the Soviet Union, the end of communist state period. Remarkable man, and meeting him and getting to know him, getting to know all of these personalities. That's just been such a privilege. Tam Diel, the senior parliamentarian of the UK, a man who I admired enormously for his courage, his tenacity, his challenging of Margaret Thatcher during the Falklands War. Remember the Belgranos.
Actually, this is in a way a very nice way to end it,
Right.
David, because it sort of shows
I'm still engaged.
but you're sitting here in a quiet and very thoughtful, meditative state, but all the time people are wanting you to comment on this and do that. So,
I mean, just to finish that sentence, the privilege of meeting Tam Diel, a real sort of iconic figure for me, and then Tam and I became friends. We sort of met up. They invited me for lunch at the House of Commons, and it turns out that we just both enjoyed each other's company. I never imagined I would meet people like that. So it's just been stunning. I enjoyed every moment of being in government. But just as I enjoyed every moment of working in chemistry here and in town, it's been tremendous. And my new life in Oxford. I know I'm not supposed to mention that.
No, don't mention Oxford. Thank you very much indeed, David.
Thank you.